Hello, my name is Dr. Julie Alexandrin, and I'm an administrator and professor for the University of Phoenix, and also the director of Alexandrin Intersectional Presentations. Today I'm here to talk about ACES. What are they? How does it impact the LGBTQ youth, and how can you help? So let's start with what ACES are. ACES is a diverse childhood experience survey, and this survey was done in 1995 and through 1997, and it looked at what negative experiences negatively affect brain and body development, and it came up with 10 different categories. So there's 3 in abuse: physical, emotional, and sexual. There's 2 in neglect: physical and emotional. And then in household dysfunction, there's 5 of them. So mental illness by anybody within the household, someone who's close to the family being incarcerated, mom treated violently, so maybe there's not violence against the kids, but there's violence against the mother, substance abuse, and then also divorce. And so what it looked at was how many of these different categories a person had. That's their ACES score. And then based on how many out of these 10 they had, we saw that typically there was more brain development issues and body development issues, meaning that they had long-term health issues and they had cognitive functioning and usually didn't do well in school. But let's look at the survey and just kind of consider it, because even though it's a very good study, it's done by Kaiser Permanente, which is a well-known medical group that's done a lot of research. It has 17,000 people who participated in it. However, the survey was only done in Southern California, and it was only done by people who belong to the health management maintenance organization of Kaiser Permanente. So in some ways, we had a very limited group that they studied, because it was only people who had access to healthcare and people who were receiving physical exams. And they did a survey when they did this. So it's important to keep this understanding, and that ACES missed a lot of people because it didn't include the whole grouping of society. It just looked at a certain group of people. So what we then have seen is that there's 2 other categories that really compound with ACEs, and one is called toxic stress. So what is toxic stress? It really is when a body is under stress all the time and continuously releasing the stress hormones and all the stress things that happen within the body when the body perceives that it's under stress. All of those pieces of things: increased blood pressure, heart palpitations, hormones, and other chemicals that are released in the body to help the body deal with stress. And so this can have negative effects, we know now, on brain development, the immune system, and metabolic regulation, and the cardiovascular system. And so how does toxic stress differ from ACEs? Most of the ACEs categories are toxic stress. However, toxic stress itself includes lots of other categories that weren't always seen in the ACEs studies. So what might have been something else that could be included in toxic stress that's not on the ACEs? Here are some. Poverty, not included, because most people who are in poverty are not going for annual exams. Dangerous neighborhood, hunger or food insecurity, school bullying or cyberbullying, racism, heterosexism, ableism, sexism, all of those isms negatively can do that. Homelessness, and of course now also the pandemic. So all of these things can create in us a long-term or extended stress period, that toxic stress system that's going to affect our system as it develops, and especially with youth. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The other thing we should talk about is trauma. So ACEs doesn't really look at trauma, but we know that trauma can do the same kind of things that stress. However, though, it's only an incident usually. It's a typical time. It can be a time that's spread over a long time when someone's recovering from something that was traumatic, but it's more just an incident. It isn't as long as toxic stress. However, we know that this can also negatively affect our nervous system, our regulatory system, and all of those things that can negatively impact youth's development. And so how does trauma differ from ACEs and toxic stress? That it's more, this is one happening. So the death of a parent. So then we need to look at what are some of the things that are trauma. So, so things that are trauma: financial distress, right? Community violence. So financial distress could be a toxic stress, or could be that we just had a period where we're having some stress at this moment. Community violence can be that there's violence within our community for, you know, a week or something, or it could be that long-term neighborhood insecurity, in safety. Dating violence, again, one-time incident or long-term. School violence, again, death of a friend, loved one, family, pet, all of those can be traumatic. A major accident, moving and switching to schools. And also realize that it doesn't have to be a traumatic event exactly. It can be the perception that it's a traumatic event, and because perception is our reality, that can also create a traumatic experience for a child. So it may be that they're talking about moving, a family's talking about moving and all of those pieces, or a family's talking about divorce. All of those pieces may not happen, but the perception of what could happen, or parents just fighting and a child thinking that their parents are going to get divorced, all of those things can negatively affect the child. So just kind of, what do we know based on ACEs? What does a high score mean? Well, it's really different for different people. ACEs only really looked at the negative pieces of it. It didn't look at the counterbalance. So, and we know that because of the support systems that we can have around us, and also how our bodies are too, some of us are more resilient than others. So just because you have a high ACEs scores doesn't mean that your life is going to be negative. But also you could have a low ACEs score, but have other toxic stress, which might create more, you having the same effects as someone who has a high ACEs scores. But to remember that just because it's an high ACEs score doesn't mean that or a low ACEs score doesn't mean that life is great and the child has no toxic stress or anything like that. But here are some important things that we have learned: that 4 or more ACEs, you're 32 more likely to have problems in school. 6 or more, you're likely to have heart disease, lung disease, or a 20-year reduction in life expectancy. And then I think that the most important one, and what we're going to kind of explore a little bit more, is that girls and lesbian, gay, and bisexual students are likely to have 3+ ACEs compared to boys and heterosexual students. So right away, we see that there's even a difference within LGB. And a lot of times we don't include the T for transgender or any gender identity or gender nonconforming, gender fluid. All of those are not included in these a lot of studies because we just haven't had a large enough pool to really fully study them. But we know that there's issues there looking at the different stressors that can happen within those categories. So let's talk about some of those stressors. So 31.8% of LGBT, so we are including the T this time, missed at least one day of school in the past month, and 10% missed 4 or more days of school because they're not feeling safe. So this is a toxic stress. They're not feeling safe in school. 95% of LGBTQ youth have trouble sleeping at night, another indication of stress. 85% of LGBTQ youth rate their stress level as 5 or higher out of a 1 to 10 scale. More than 70% report feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. So when we're not feeling good about ourselves, we're also in a stressful situation because we're not feeling that we can meet what's happening around us. 75% report verbal abuse, and 1 in 7 report being physically attacked. So the verbal abuse and the physical attack may be just once, but it could be a traumatic experience that when a youth is in a similar situation, they could be having stress over that. So that's the other leading piece with trauma too, is that the traumatic event could have happened, but when there are situations that are similar or perceived similar situations, the stress hormone is released again in the body. Also, what's really important is looking at what's happening within the home and for youth who are LGBTQIA. So 67% here have heard family members make negative comments about LGBTQ people. 24% can definitely be themselves an LGBTQ person at home. Only 24%. So especially in a pandemic like this, there's some real issues there. There's some kids who are having some real trouble being in the situation where they are. And 48% of youth who are out to their parents, their families make them feel bad about being LGBTQ. So these are all toxic stress issues for youth that are now compounded because of the pandemic and them being sheltering in place or staying at home with the people who may not be fully accepting who they are. So let's talk about the effects of toxic stress and trauma and ACEs on the body and the development of the body. So let's first just kind of have you think about it. So imagine that you're being in a stressful situation. How does your body feel? What if it's a toxic stress? What if you're in stress all the time? How do you think your body is going to start to feel? And what effects do you think it might have on the body by feeling that all the time? How do you think toxic stress will affect a growing youth's body? So imagine being in that stress all the time and having that elevated kind of revving thing and all the time. What's that going to do? So this is what we have found out. So it really is a car revving, right? So when you're in stress, your system is geared in. And part of it is because of our lower brain functioning of that fight, flight, or freeze, right? So we're in a stressful situation, our body's like, okay, I'm ready to do what I need to do. So I'm going to be really watching and be hyperactive, hyper vigilant of what's happening around me. I'm going to be watching and listening and hearing and feeling, and I'm going to be waiting, and I'm going to have my body ready, right? That's why our heart rate increases and our blood pressure increases, because if we have to run or we have to fight, our body needs to be ready to do that. So think about if you were revving your car all the time, what negative things are going to happen to that car? The same kind of things are going to happen to the body. And so here's what we know, that the immune system, when it's in the stressed thing, it starts being having lots of inflammation, and inflammation can cause asthma, arthritis, and other, and it can negatively affect the organs in our bodies, right? We're now seeing that with the childhood inflammation syndrome that they're now having for kids who have been exposed to COVID, but are not, their immune system is not relaxing and coming back down after they finish having the COVID itself. Your metabolic system, so your regulatory system, your intestines, kidneys, they're less able to eliminate toxins. They have a slow gut, unbalanced flora, because what happens is that when our body's like, oh my goodness, we need to get ready to run, a lot of the organs that aren't as essential as like the heart and the lungs, right? So your intestines and your kidneys aren't given as much blood and aren't given as much attention. So a lot of times this is why kids can have issues with their stomach when they're upset or they're nervous, because the stomach isn't getting as much attention as it should be from the rest of the body. And so this again can negatively affect how your body, how these organs and your systems within your body that are not always essential when we're in a crisis situation are given. And then cardiovascular, right? So if my heart is pumping hard, my blood pressure is up all the time, that's really going to be hard on my heart, and it's going to be hard on my veins throughout my system. And so those are all going to be negative and negatively affect me, especially long term, right? The more my heart's being actively pumping really hard and really things, the harder it's going to be, the more stress it's going to have on the heart. And that's going to make the heart harder for the heart to last longer, right? And there's that 20-year difference. And then we also, though, see cellular changes. So remember that our body is cells that reproduce and take and clear out kind of every 7 years. We have a kind of a fresh body, right? So every 7 years we're regenerating our cells. So our cells are always regenerating. They're creating red blood cells and white blood cells all the time, right? And so if you're copying something when you're under stress, right, your copying is not as good. And it's the same thing. When our cells reproduce under stress, they don't reproduce as well. And because of that, the DNA within our cells gets negatively affected. So what we've seen is youth who are young, they might have, they might be 7 or 8, but looking at their DNA, it might be in their cells, looking at that cellular level of what's going on, their cells may be equivalent to a 20 or 30-year-old because they've had so much stress with that reproduction. And so it's been harder for the cell system. So, and this is what causes cancer, and it can also be the premature aging. And again, something that's going to affect that 20-year gap that we see kids with higher ACES scores. And then let's talk about the brain development, right? Okay, so imagine being in a stressful situation. How good is your cognitive thinking, right? Are you thinking clearly? Are you thinking well? What about if that's all the time? And what is your main focus? Like when you're in a toxic situation or a trauma situation, is your focus on how do I learn math? Or is your focus on what do I do to make the situation safer? And how do I get out of it, right? And so that's the main focus for these youth who are dealing with this. And then how might the toxic or stress or your trauma affect your behavior. So, right, our cognitive functioning is connected to our behaviors. And this is one of the biggest things that we see with youth, is that youth who have high ACEs scores, who have had traumatic events, who have had toxic stress in their life, their behaviors may not be the same type of behaviors that we have come to kind of anticipate from youth who we see who don't grow up with these negative side effects, these negative pieces on their life. And so, and how is this all going to affect brain development, right? And a kid being able to, or youth being able to do well in school and learn what they need to learn in school? It's not going to do well, right? So we kind of have these two different pyramids that go together. So we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We need to meet our physical needs, then we need to do our safety needs or physiological needs. We go to the bathroom, we have food, we get sleep, all of those things. Then we have the safety needs, and we need to make sure that we feel safe. Well, the same thing is happening in the brain, right? So our brain stem is our lower functioning part of our brain, and that making sure that you have your physiological needs met. And if you're not getting your physiological needs met and your safety needs met, then your brain is staying just at that brain stem level. It's not really going, it might go up a little bit to the midbrain, but really that's where your focus is, because it's stressed. It's worried about fight or flight. And our brainstem and our midbrain, they're the ones who regulate that, right? And so then we need our social needs. We need to make sure that we're feeling safe around us and that we have social interaction with other people, and that we start emotional needs. And that also comes with our self-esteem needs. Well, that's our limbic system, right? So again, if we can't get up to that emotional piece, if we're worried about, what's going to happen when I go home today, my brain is not going up to how do I make relationships with friends. My brain is still on how do I make sure I'm safe when I go home. And so my brain isn't going up to the limbic system, and it's definitely not really going up to your frontal cortex level, right? So that front part of your brain that really makes us different from other animals, right? If we are not feeling, if the lower functioning pieces of the brain are not feeling safe, it's not accessing that frontal cortex. And so when the brain's not accessing that frontal cortex, the frontal cortex is also not getting developed. And when our limbic system is not totally dealing with emotions and connections and self-esteem needs, then we're not learning how to connect and make relationships with other people around us. And so this is really what negatively affects our brain development, is that youth who don't feel safe, who are in toxic stress most of the time, their brain is mostly just focused on the lower parts and not developing and increasing the ability to use those higher functioning parts of the brain. And so we really see that when we kind of look at kind of a typical development brain, right? Survival is very little. We look more at regulation. We look more at social emotional development, and we really can get to that place where we're cognitive. Whereas when we have developmental trauma or toxic stress or high ACEs scores, our emphasis is much more on survival and regulation, making sure that my body is kind of regulating and do what it needs to do, where I have much less capacity to do social emotional connections with others, and also to work on my cognitive, that frontal cortex of my brain. And so that's really where we start to have issues for the youth. And so when this happens over years, the youth their brain is not developing. They're not connecting with others as the same. They're not emotionally developing like other typically developing youth, and they're not using their frontal cortex as much. And that's the biggest difference that we see with these youth. And let's talk about behaviors, because we all use behaviors as calmers and protectors. And a lot of times we see these kids who have high ACEs scores, high trauma in their family, high toxic stress in their family, in their growing up years, they also have behaviors that we don't always expect or we don't always understand. And so, and a lot of times we treat them negatively because we've had these unexpected understanding of why they behave the way that they do. So realize that all of our behaviors are connected to our needs and our wants as perceived as calming or protectors, right? So all of the behaviors that we do either because it meets one of our needs or because it gets something that we want, or it avoids something that we want. So, and for youth who are in these, really for all of us, most of the time we're looking to either calm or protect ourselves by doing the behaviors that we do. And realize that all of your past all of your past affects your behaviors today. And whether it's cognitively that you've cognitively changed behaviors, or you've unconsciously changed behaviors, but everything that's happened in our past affects what we do today and how we behave. It's also important to remember that, that we judge the youth based on what they're doing to create and protect themselves. And sometimes what's seen as appropriate and works at home may not also work at school or in other community settings. So for like an example, one youth that I worked with was a child who had autism, and he had a father who yelled at home. And because of that, the kid didn't like it. He had sensory issues, right? So whenever the dad yelled, what did the child do? The child ran up to his room and hid in his closet. Totally acceptable and very and good protective behavior at home. That's not, in a first grade classroom, that's not a good protective behavior. Someone yells in a first grade classroom, this kid would bolt out the door and go find some place to hide, right? So totally protective behavior, something that was protective and making him feel safe, but didn't work in a different environment. And so a lot of the behaviors that we see for kids that we think are inappropriate at school or in a community setting, it's because they've learned to do them either because they're calming or they're protectors of them in other situations. So think about what behaviors make you feel calm. You know, think, what makes me feel calm? What behaviors do I do that protect myself in uncertain situations? And what behaviors might protect myself from taking risks? And have I ever found myself doing a behavior that's in one environment's okay, but may not be totally acceptable in another one? And all of us usually can say yes to all of these questions. So think about those things for just a sec. And then let's talk about, so calming behaviors are behaviors we do, and most of the time unconsciously, that help calm our nervous system. And we all do them. We all have these. Right? And we have learned, most of us have learned to do socially acceptable behaviors that are calming behaviors that are socially accepted. So if, sometimes picking can calm people. And so people have learned not to do that in public or not to do it in places that people can see. Or, hand flapping, we've seen with kids, or, physically rocking. And we've seen that when we do those behaviors and we see negativeness on people's faces around us, or people who come out and say, don't do those behaviors, we've learned to change our behaviors to socially acceptable ways that people don't really, don't think of it as much. So a huge one is playing with your hair, that people, put fingers and play with their hair. That calms them. It feels calming. The bouncing of one's knee, the clicking of a pen, routines. So we all have routines that make us feel calm. The way we come home at night, where we put our keys, where we take off our coat, where we put our shoes. And if we get interrupted in those routines, it just throws us all off, because routines, that expectation of knowing what's going to happen next, that calms us. And pacing, sometimes that also can be a calming. And then let's talk about protectors. So protective behaviors are automatic in some situations, especially when your lower functioning brain perceives that something's bad's happening. So sometimes we do things that we don't always even realize that we're doing, because that lower functioning brain takes over and it makes cognitive thinking impossible. So let's think about, it's like a youth who's in a large family with limited food. That youth may be taught to grab food right away as soon as it comes on the table, because if you don't, you're not going to get it. So that child then may do that same behavior in a first grade classroom when they're having a school function, and that child may grab food right away. And other people are like, well, that's inappropriate. But that might be a protective skill of making sure he gets enough food when he's at his house. Right? And protectives can also sometimes seem counterproductive to certain situations. So a big one for youth who have had a lot of adults come through their life and, connected with them, and then they've left, and connected and left. They've now learned that when a new adult comes into their life, they're like, hold off, I don't want to be near you, because if I don't let you into my life, then you can't hurt me. And so these are the kids who are like, doing anything they can to keep you at bay, because they're afraid that you're going to hurt them when you leave. And so these are, again, protective behaviors. And the other biggest protective behavior is that fight, flight, or freeze, right? So when our nervous system, our lower functioning brain thinks that that the things are just way too out of control or things are just not safe, it totally takes over. It shuts down that frontal cortex and it takes over with that fight, flight, or freeze. And to realize when that happens is that frontal cortex, it's not functioning. This is also called flipping your lid. So a lot of times we'll talk to youth that like your brain is your fist, right? And this is your frontal cortex is up here. And when you flip your lid, when things get really things, you flipped it up and that frontal cortex, it's not in line. It's not happening. And youth don't know how to, so you can't communicate with them. They can't calm them down because their frontal cortex is gone. It's flipped. And so sometimes even just doing the flipping of the lid helps youth start to realize what's happening and that some of it is kind of out of their control. Doesn't mean that we give them permission to do whatever they want, but to realize in those situations at that time, there's not a lot of intervention that we can do besides trying to make sure that we keep them and others around them safe. And so we flip our lid because there's a perceived threat, environmental threat, and that perceived threat can be, and it's a perception of the youth. So it may not be that other people are perceiving it or that it's really happening, but that perception of that youth, and it can be that it's happening now or it's going to happen in just a second. So a youth may refuse to go into a classroom or into an auditorium because they're feeling that they won't be safe in that auditorium. So their behavior to keep them outside of that auditorium might be flight or fright when someone's trying to get them to go into that auditorium. It's also when strong emotions are going to be there. So if a body perceives that this negative, very negative, strong emotion is going to happen, our bodies are very good at saying, nope, we don't want you to experience that negative emotion. We're going to take over. So we're going to make sure that you don't experience that negative emotion. So it can happen for either of those. And also the time of year can ease or increase the flipping of the lid. So a lot of times around the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas are very stressful times for different families. And so we can see kids flipping their lid a lot more than we do see sometimes in like the middle of the school year where things are pretty routine and there's not a lot of disruptions. So again, so we can also have that like, I enjoy school. School's a safe place. I know there's a vacation coming up. I know summer vacation's coming up. I'm going to be in a not as good a spot. So my lid's going to keep flipping more because I'm not going to have as good control over my lower functioning brain than I might when I know that things are going to be safe and that I'm okay. But think about, when was the last time you flipped your lid? We as adults flip our lids also. That's something that gets us very upset. We don't really know. We take it out. How did you feel? How did others perceive your behavior? And could you have done something different in the moment? And a lot of times people will say, nope, couldn't have done anything different. And this could be someone's threatening our child. We have road rage. All those kinds of things will flip our lid. And adults do it. One of the conferences I presented at this year, we were doing this slide. I was co-presenting with somebody else. And so we ahead of time did a survey of all the people who were coming. We had over 300 people registered for the session. So it was kind of a small little study. But 50% of the people said that they had flipped their lid within the last year. So this is happening. And so the other thing that we bring this up is not to shame your thing, but the reality is that we all do this. It's just that youth with toxic stress and ACEs and trauma are much more likely to do it on a more regular basis. And then us who are much better emotionally and can regulate ourselves a little bit better. Right? So when someone flips their lid, their cognitive function goes offline, they're also really very sorry about what happens afterwards because they didn't have complete control over what was happening and what they were doing. So the sorrow and the sorriness is real and genuine. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, they're just wanting to make, feel better. No, they feel badly about what happens. Most kids do not want to flip their lid. Most kids will do what they can to make sure that they're not doing inappropriate behaviors, that they are following rules because they want to do that. But a lot of times they don't have the skills or the emotional ability or the cognitive functioning to be able to help themselves do that. The best way to support is to start to watch behaviors. So if I have a youth that flips their lid every once in a while, I'm going to really watch those behaviors and see if I can intervene and support them before they get to the flipping of the lid. Because remember, cognitive functioning is offline when they flip. So I need to connect with them, and I need to help and support them in dealing with their emotions and helping them create a safe way to deal with what's happening by doing that. And we learn to stop them that way. So let's talk about ways to support these kids. So the best indicator of a youth graduating high school and going on to a trade school or college, a trusting relationship with an adult at school. Number one, best indicator. The best way to support resiliency in a youth and counterbalance the effects of ACEs, toxic stress, or trauma, a trusting relationship with an adult, and that adult can be you. We see the difference of just one adult, because one adult can create that safety and then help that youth deal with what's happening cognitively in their brain, that they learn to regulate, that they learn how to calm themselves and create protective behaviors that are socially acceptable and that meet their needs and help them keep progressing, which then allows them to also use their frontal cortex much more and much stronger, so they can really start to have that learning piece. So that's it. And we see this difference. Here's in a 2017 study in Maine, where we're looking at youth who have 3 or more ACEs, so just those first 10 things. When they had a support from a non-parental adult, 26.3% consider suicide. But if they had less support from non-parental adults, it went up to 40. Difference of one person. The other thing too, it can also be just that caring community of school as compared to non-caring community in school. So caring community of school, 26.9. So it's pretty similar to that support from non-parental adults. Less caring school, 37.7. So it's not as high in effect as a support. So we see how important that is for youth who are connecting with someone who is not their parent, and how much that can support them and reduce these statistics. And smoking cigarettes is another one that we look at. And again, you can see the differences there. It's interesting that the school has more influence in smoking than the suicide. So it's interesting. Anyway, so the best way to support youth who experience ACEs, toxic stress, or trauma is creating a relationship with the youth where you give unconditional support. No matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter what you throw at me, no matter how you act to me, I am going to be here and I'm going to support you, right? And so for that youth to know that, because they've had very few people who have done that. They've had very few people that, they were okay with them until they hit somebody, or they were okay with them until this thing happened. No, you're going to be there no matter what. Doesn't matter what the youth is going to do. And I can tell you, I've had, I think, every word in this yelled at me, and I think I've had everything thrown at me, and I still am there for that youth. I'm still there. I'm still there to hold their hand. I'm still there the next day with a smile on my face. I'm still there to support them. And then the other piece too is keeping promises. If you say that you're going to do something, don't say you're going to do something unless you really know that you can do that. And this also includes consequences for behaviors, right? Have you ever seen that a parent will say, I'm not going to let you do that if you do that. And then the kid does it and the parent doesn't do anything. Kids need to know that if you say you're going to do something, you're going to do it, whether it's a negative consequences, whether it's positive consequence, all of that, because then the environment becomes more predictable and it becomes a safer environment. The other piece too is, if I know that if you say you're going to do that and I misbehave, this happens, I also know if other people do that you're going to make sure that stops also. So especially as a teacher, if you say that no one can say this, if you're going to punish just me and not others with the same consequences, then I'm not going to think that this is a safe place, because I don't know to predict what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. And if you do promise something, and for some reason, because everyone's wild, promises that we really, really, really want to keep don't happen, make sure that you say you apologize for it and you take responsibility for not being able to meet that promise. And you also let the kid tell you how that made them feel. This allows them to start developing their feelings, but it also allows them to know that we do make mistakes and that mistakes are okay, but yet we take responsibility when we do make mistakes and that we care. Don't hold grudges. You know, if something happens and you deal with the consequence, the next time it's done. You're clean slate. Next time I meet you, the next day, wherever I see you again, it's going to be a clean slate and we're going to start over. Because that way, then the kid knows that, again, whatever they do, whether it was slipping their lid and something happened, that you're not going to hold that against them, that there's a way for them to get out of the hole that they might have dug. And then to make sure that what your words are saying is also what your body language and your tone is saying. So the majority of the way that we communicate is body language and also the tone of our words. And so a lot of times we could say something really happy, but if our body language is, you know, arms crossed and we're looking stern, it doesn't matter what we're saying because the kids are seeing their body language. And especially kids who have had trauma and toxic stress, they're very good at reading body language because they've had to learn to read body language. And so body language and the tone of your voice really makes a difference to these kids. So we really want to make sure if you really are saying what you believe, then your tone and your body language should also be saying the same thing. And so 2 important aspects to remember when you're working with youth. A youth perception is their reality, as it is for all of us. So if I think that someone is being mean to me, though nobody else does, then that's my reality. And you can't just keep telling me no. What's going to work better is for me to tell you why I think that, and then to start to talk about what are real symbols or real interactions or real social norms of what is a friend and what isn't a friend and how people act. And this might be that the youth has just grown up not having those pieces, or with people who weren't always social, behaving as we expect with social norms, right? So their perception is their reality. Our perception is our reality. And we need to accept that. We can't just tell people, no, you don't feel that way, or no, that's not the reality of the situation. We need to help them learn to see that that may not be the real perception. And again, we need to make sure that what we're communicating is via our language. So communication is 70% nonverbal, 23% tone, and only 7% of what you said. So why it's so important for that body language and that. Also, when we think about punishment, this was from a performance of a group that I saw of youth who created this and really talked about what punishment is to them, that it's time, that's negative thoughts, that it's enraged, that it's mental and emotional scars, that it's hostility, that it's shame, that it's isolation, that it's negative, or it's neglect, it's unwilling to forgive, and then it's pain. So punishment without really connecting with the student and without really having them understand what's going on and what might not have been appropriate or why it wasn't appropriate. When we just punish them and when we just suspend kids, what do? The biggest thing, go away. When we put kids in timeout, what are we telling them? Go away. Go away from us. Don't be near us. We don't want you. You're not worth it. You're not part of that. And that's really what this punishment. Whereas if we're looking at consequences, we're looking at what happened, how can we help the youth develop and grow from that experience, and that experience won't happen again? And how can we help them change what we see as inappropriate behaviors into behaviors that are appropriate and that are appropriate for the situation and that are seen as more positive. And so doesn't mean that you can't say no. It doesn't mean that if a child does something that you can't have a negative piece, but we want to make sure that negative piece connects to the behavior and helps the child grow. So restorative justice comes into this piece, looking at a child who does graffiti on the walls, suspending them, isn't going to do much, but maybe having them clean after school a couple days with the facilities management's people at the school, that may help the youth see the negative effects of what they did for others, but it may also allow them then to make connections with others at the school and help them realize what their negative behavior did and how it negatively affected others. So again, a consequence, but a consequence that's connected to what the youth did. youth who are having trouble doing schoolwork, keeping them inside during recess is not going to help them do the schoolwork better the next time. Those may be the kids who really need to go out for recess and run around, and maybe they're the kids who need to sit with you and really have time and make sure that they have the basic skills underneath to be able to do the work, or that they're feeling safe in that classroom so they can focus on what's happening cognitively for them to do that exercises. So the most important things to take away from this session is that relationships with youth make a difference, but make sure that they're genuine relationships, and make sure that they are two-way relationships, that it's not just you, but it's you and the youth connecting with each other, and that you're having a relationship where you are both supporting each other. Youth perspective is their reality. That what you are communicating through your behaviors and your expectations. So what am I communicating to my youth by what I'm asking them to do and the way that I'm talking about it and asking them to do it. That changes are never a straight line forward, right? So we're asking these youth to change, we're supporting them through changes, and so we might have some really great growth, and then we might have maybe a little regression, and then we're gonna grow again, and then we might have a little dip. Growth isn't a straight line, and that's totally normal. And then the other thing too that a lot of times people don't realize is that as youth start to feel safe sometimes in environments, we start to see sometimes behavior issues go up. And the reason is because they're using their energy to sometimes to hold in and behave correctly. And sometimes when we finally create a safe place for them, but other places are not safe, they're going to hold it in the other places, and then they're going to let themselves go when they're with you. And so indirectly it's saying, hey, this is a safe place where I can let it go, where I need to let it go so that I have energy later to pull it all in again. And so we really see this with like someone who has Tourette's syndrome and tics. We'll see that like a child who has tics, as they become more comfortable, we'll see an increase in tics, and then we will see eventually a decrease in tics as they become more comfortable in all the areas of the school setting. But we sometimes will see if one class is comfortable and the rest is not, we'll see an uptick in the tics in that. But we'll see other behaviors that show us that the youth is connecting and that they're seeing this as a safe place. So it might be that they're coming to you during lunch, or they're coming to you during recess, or they're checking in with you every day as they walk into school. Those other behaviors will let you know you're doing a great job, even though you might be seeing an increase in behaviors. And to realize that piece, because to behave for a lot of kids, or to follow social norms and all those, when they have not learned those, that's a lot of work. And so when they don't have to do that much work, then they release themselves so they can use that cognitive functioning as they're still learning those socially appropriate and appropriate behaviors within the environment that they're in. So that's the presentation. Here are my references, and I hope that this benefits you. Feel free to email me at Alexandrin@gmail.com, and hope that you've learned from this thing if you have any questions. Anyway, have a great day. Bye-bye.